Our guest today is Courtenay. She's the CEO of Bryce Courtenay International and is responsible for managing the literary estate of her late husband, Bryce Courtenay. She was co-founder of the Australian Himalayan Expedition, should I say, 1975 to 1988, later becoming World Expeditions, and served as Nepalese Honorary Consul General. She's also a founding member of the Australian Himalayan Foundation. In a lifetime, she's worked alongside acclaimed authors, world-renowned mountaineers, decorated polar explorers. Adding to that list of achievements, she is our author today, talking about a truly incredible book called Bryce Courtenay, Storyteller, a memoir of the late Bryce Courtenay, for which she has kindly agreed to speak to us about today. Christine, thank you so much for agreeing to join us today.
Thank you, Jordan. It's wonderful to speak with you.
So as discussed, we've had a lot of positive reviews from our blind and low vision community regarding your book, not to mention myself. For those who have it on their list to read but haven't read the book yet, are you happy to do a little bit of a reading from the book or give us a little bit of information regarding it?
Yes, I'd be delighted to do that. And it's really a subject close to my heart for people with any vision issues, because my father was a prisoner of war on the Thai-Burma Railway, and he lost his sight as a result of the bad food. And he used to be a great reader, but when he came back from the war, he used to listen to his talking books. So I was very thrilled to be able to record an audio version of the book Bryce Courtenay, Storyteller, which is my love story to Bryce, and it's also the first memoir of his life as tribute to 10 years now since he passed away on November 22nd, 2012. And be happy to read from it. As we're in Australia, it might be nice that I write a little bit about the first time Bryce set foot in Australia. It's from chapter 7, A Long Way from Devil's Kloof. Any fool knows that to sell a cause, you have to have a proposition. Words gather round a good proposition like bees around mimosa blossom. The pitch. Bryce arrived in Sydney on a glorious day in late November 1958, and it was love at first sight, as Bryce described in The Silver Moon. Everything about Australia was right. The sky was high, the land and people felt familiar. From day one, I felt like an Australian. I remember we came through the heads and that was it. Then we could see land, and I noticed a white house with a splash of bougainvillea. I immediately thought, I want to own that house. He arrived in Australia carrying only one suitcase and with barely enough money to stay at a local youth hostel. The whole world fell about my ears almost on arrival.
Fantastic way to start. Obviously, this book is your first book. So was it challenging writing on something as close to home as your late husband?
At first, honestly, Jordan, I just wrote one essay called our first chapter, really about how Bryce and I met. And it was really kind of a practice chapter because I had started writing a memoir of my own little life called Annapurna Sunrise, about starting the trekking company. And so in that sense, starting the book wasn't challenging. But then when I found the box of letters, which I did in June 2020, that's when I kept thinking, gosh, I can't turn my back on this. I wonder if I could write a biography of Bryce's life. But then I thought, you know what? I don't think I will. He always said he never wanted one written. He wanted to be remembered for his works. And I thought I should respect that. But, you know, it kept gnawing away at me. And as I kept writing, as Bryce would have said, the writing muscle began to get stronger and I got better. But writing a memoir is a very daunting and tricky thing. There are a huge amount of challenges, but I think you just write one day at a time, and you're in the raft going down the rapids, and probably that's the best way to not look up and not think about it too much.
Yeah, look, you preempted a many number of questions on that one. So I'm sure you may or may not have been tired of hearing this, but Bryce was deemed a national treasure in every sense. What were you hoping the reader would take away from your book?
Well, I thought they would be fascinated to understand, as I did when I did all the research over many, many, many months, how much of Bryce he put into his published works, even more than I had thought previously. I also wanted it to be an authentic story. I mean, Bryce said, whitewashing a family story isn't a story at all. But I also wanted it to be gracious and dignified. And I also wanted it to inspire others to hold tight to their dreams, just as Bryce did, in spite of all the tragedies and dramas and heartache and tragedy that he experienced throughout his life.
Yeah, and we've already sort of touched on that you were writing a bit of a memoir that kind of inspired the idea behind a book, and you came across a couple of, well, not just a couple, was it a shoebox of letters?
Well, Jordan, I'd moved back from where Bryce and I were living in Canberra when he passed away.
Yeah.
And you know what it's like when you move, you have all these boxes and you're kind of sorting them out. Well, one day I was down in my garage and I found this box of letters. First, I thought they must have been old handwritten business letters, and I came close to throwing them out. And then I started to read them. I thought, oh my goodness, these were written by Bryce to his mother. Took them upstairs. There were 141. And I read them pretty much straight through. And of course, I was deeply moved and shocked at what he'd gone through. But I also thought, these are incredible, because this means if I do this book, which, by the way, I'll just give to his grandchildren, it won't be published, so there's nothing to worry about. And I thought the great thing is you can write the story largely in his voice and at the time he was writing those letters, whether he was a 7-year-old, a 20-year-old, a 45-year-old. I mean, it was a pure cachet of gold for the manuscript, and I couldn't walk away from that.
Yeah, I was going to say, what might have been a gnawing feeling that you wanted to write it kind of had a bit of a gold nugget dropped in your lap with that. That's that would have been
fate, isn't it? How that happens? Like, why didn't I find them earlier? Bryce had never mentioned them, and in a way, although the tragedy of COVID for so many has been terrible, probably if there hadn't been the COVID lockdown and everything, I wouldn't have had so much time on my hands to sit down and even begin to write the book. I think, writing from when Bryce and I were together wasn't so difficult because I was there, but writing those first, chapters, 10 or 11 chapters before we were together, that was like a bit of a minefield, working, out what happened, and when it happened. That was really, I used to look up at Bryce's portrait on my office wall and say, this just doesn't make any sense. And I could feel him grinning down and saying, oh, darling, you work it out. You're the writer now.
Well, I was going to ask the question. So you said Bryce had not been overtly keen on a memoir being written of him. Surely, I'm guessing he would have expected that there probably would be. You would have had offers from other authors to write the book, I'm guessing. Was there a sense of closure coming from you writing it yourself?
Well, it's correct. Bryce, although he never actually told me that the publisher had begged him to write it. They told me after he passed away. I had asked him to write it. He'd always fob me off and say, oh, darling, what would be interesting about it? Then he said in a couple of interviews, well, as his great friend Morris West said, there's only one problem about writing a autobiography. I don't much care for the central character. And then in another interview, he said, oh, an autobiography, it's a little too grand for someone like me. But, Dickens, his great literary hero, said, I want to be remembered for my published works. And that's how he felt. But I think there was probably more to it than that. I mean, I suspect it might have been too painful to revisit those tough times in his life. And, he had written a work of nonfiction in April Fool's Day about the tragedy of losing his son, Damon.
Yeah.
But I never really got to the bottom of it. He certainly would have. I used to say to him, well, you should write it because then you get first go and it's in, you can lay it, down on the record of what happened. But he really wasn't interested in doing it. And in the end, a lot of people that did approach me, they were mostly journalists, but I just felt they didn't have that instinct for Bryce. They didn't know him as I did as his wife. And I knew I was able to bring, if you like, an intimacy to the story. And I think that gives the book a kind of resonance that it wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah, definitely. So we have obviously spoken, well, we've spoken to many people that are avid readers of Bryce's works. A lot of them have said that they expressed that they often felt personally connected with Bryce. In your opinion, does the book kind of support this theory?
Jordan, it definitely does. Bryce had a unique connection with his readers. He used to refer to them as the fourth protagonist in his novels. And he made a huge effort to connect with them. As you know, he signed thousands of books. He gave thousands of lectures. He participated in a lot of charity events.
Yeah.
He answered nearly all his fan mail personally. He wasn't really much into social media, as you might understand, but he appreciated what it was. And there are still 59,000 followers on the official Bryce Courtenay Facebook page. And they love Bryce and respect him both for his literary works as for how he lived his life. But they, I think, hankered to know more about the man behind the books. And an old friend of his said to me, you know, Christine, it's been 10 years. In the fullness of time, I think Bryce would feel now was a good time for a book to come out. He would have been amazed that it was me. I mean, he knew I could write, but I still think he would have been amazed at the amount of effort, blood, sweat and toil, you know, I put into it over nearly 2 years. And I'm still recovering, I have to tell you.
Well, you kind of once again preempted my next question, which was obviously Bryce began writing. He'd obviously written previous to that throughout his lifetime, but he began writing later in his life. You've described yourself as an accidental author. Can you see any similarities between your path to writing and his?
In a sense, I think writers kind of have a writing gift. I used to say that to Bryce. I actually think I have a small one as well. I mean, I've been writing all my life by public relations and marketing, adventure travel, and promoting authors and working on expeditions, etc. And Bryce was always writing from a child. He was always doing cartoons. He used to write poetry, and all of his family were writers. And you know, I think it's a really a big help. You can learn to be better. I did a lot of writing courses. I sat in him on Bryce's. I used to watch how he worked his way out of all the minefields of the book. But even if you think you know how to write a book, you don't until you sit down and try and do it. And sometimes it pours out of you and it's quite easy, but sometimes you hit brick walls. That's
Well,
when the pain starts.
definitely taken, I hope you don't mind me saying, quite a mammoth task as your first book. Many writers, including Bryce, as you've set out as well, spoken about the challenges associated with writing non-fiction as opposed to fiction. You've obviously chosen to write a true story about a man who created stories from his imagination and obviously from his earlier life. Did you get to a point in writing the novel where you had doubts that you could portray him properly to you, or was that something that you sort of wrestled with frequently?
I thought that I could portray it. What was difficult was getting all the dots to add up with the information.
Yeah.
For those early years, because really a lot of his relatives have passed away. His sister sadly has serious memory issues. So I was really very reliant on the letters and on interviews that Bryce did. Fortunately, he did hundreds of them, and he spoke to the oral history unit at the National Library, thank goodness. And we used to have conversations, not that he talked about his past a lot. He never did much to his children, they've told me, when they were growing up. So I thought that was really tough getting. I was so relieved when I started to write our first chapter, which is when we met, because then I was sort of on home ground. But
Yeah.
In some ways, writing fiction is easier, I think, because you can make it all up. And like even when Bryce wrote The Power of One, he said, well, I just thought I'd start by writing what I knew growing up in Africa. And it was more autobiographical than I think he generally acknowledged.
Yeah, definitely. definitely. So you've already touched on some of the research that you undertook for this book. I imagine it was quite a lot of research to go through it. And take me through it. So you're writing this book. How does a day sort of map out writing this book? Where you're thinking, oh well, I need to contact this person to see what they can tell me about Bryce, or how did you sort of play it out with your writing process?
Jordan, I've just finished reading a book by John le Carré. It's actually a book of his letters, and he talked a lot about how he wrote. I thought, gosh, that's really what I did. What I tended to do was I'd start a chapter, whether I knew much or not, and I'd kind of pour it all out. Then I would tended to go back and fill in the gaps with the research. And that's when I'd go to different letters. That's when I'd go to different interviews. That's when I'd go back to his own novels. Or that's when I think, gosh, I need to ring up Alex Hamill, or I need to ring up Dr. Quresh Hagigi, or I need to ring up his son, Brett Courtenay, or I need to talk to his relatives in South Africa, or I need to talk to his grandson. And then I'd kind of fill in the gaps. But there are a lot of inconsistencies as well in a lot of the material. And that was some things I just didn't know in the end. And I just had to say, I don't know about this. And that was exasperating. But I was researching and writing at the same time. And I think I was a bit casual at the start because I didn't think it was going to be published. And I thought, oh, well, I'd sometimes not do anything for a week or 10 days. But once I signed a contract, I think it was in October 2021, that's when real panic set in, because you realize, oh my God, I've got to deliver the book and it's going to be set in stone and I better lift my game. And suddenly I had no life, no days, no nights.
Yeah.
It was really, I don't remember what I ate, what I wore, what I did,
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, like a lot of authors that we've spoken to have, they've gone through that process of the elevator pitch to a publicist. And when they're finally, yep, you've got the book deal, there's been this stricken panic of, oh no, now I'm going to have to deliver on all of this in this time frame. I was quite happy just seeing it, just testing the waters to see if there was interest. Obviously, Penguin were very interested in the work. Was there things that you changed along the way, or was there things that they suggested that would make the book flow better or anything like that?
Well, they had asked me to do the book about 9 months or so after Bryce passed away, but I rejected the request out of hand because I just kept thinking, well, Bryce said he didn't want one.
Yeah.
But as for help along the way, fortunately, I was truly blessed to have Rachel Scully as my editor. And she had worked with Bryce on many of his books. She knew Bryce very well. She loved his work. And she said, oh, I was a bit like him, handing in books chapter by chapter, last minute to midnight. We were 6 months late. And she had her English, was fantastic. And she helped me with a lot of things like that. But also she'd say, you've written about Paddy's childhood, but then there's a 9-year gap. What happened? Or she'd say, we actually found a real blunder in the book where I'd put an anecdote in that someone had given me, but what they said was something Bryce had exaggerated a bit, and it was actually just wrong, because he was talking about the power of one to someone. This guy said when they were running a marathon in 1983 or 93, I think. Yeah, 83, sorry. And she said, it was another editor that was helping on the book, said, the power of one wasn't published then. That was published in 1989. You think, right, okay. So we had to, you got the odd clanger.
Yeah.
But sometimes there were things that I'd get to a crossroads and think, gosh, should I include that? Is that too sensitive? There's living people.
Yeah.
And as Bryce said, if you shake any family cupboard, it rattles like hell. You have to be sensitive. You don't want to hurt people. There are some things you can't include, and I chose not to. And I don't regret that. I mean, you've got to live with yourself. You've got to be fair and decent. And that was very important to me, while still writing a real story, because I realised a lot of people think any book written by a wife is going to be sugar-coated and not worth reading. I didn't want my book to be like that.
No, and it definitely didn't read like that either. So well, I will say this much. So Bryce was, you've described as a man unfailingly positive in the book, and I'm sure you've probably described him as that to other people as well. Did it surprise you? Well, it sounds like it surprised you a little bit that he'd endured so much in his earlier life.
I knew it had been tough, but I didn't know a lot of the details. I didn't know a lot of the suffering. I didn't know too much about his mother's bad health and how much she was really rejected by her community for being an unmarried mother. She was penniless. She had mental health problems. And just the amount of times they moved. I mean, one year they moved she moved like 19 times. And, she did have family members. You sort of think, well, did they reach out, or could they have reached out more, or did she reject it? I mean, I think she was someone that didn't settle. But it was really heartbreaking. And you think he could have easily, as Bryce once said in an interview with Peter Thompson, become an alcoholic or just working on railway tracks. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it really shows what personal courage and determination and resilience he had, that he always thought he'd live a better life. He'd crawl his way out of this. And from a very early age, he said, I'm going to be a writer. And what's more, I'm going to be a world famous one. I mean, that's really extraordinary. He could have just fallen over really in a heap. And many of his family members were alcoholics. So that gene was in his family. And he was always conscious of that, even though he did drink, sometimes a bit too much.
Yeah, as we all at times. And look, I think you described when you were originally sort of looking through the notes of this book that was sort of gnawing away at you. So you went to his books for clues originally to unwrap the character that he was. Did one character in any of his books stand out to you?
Well, PK is really an obvious one because that was really straight from the heart. Was Bryce really, in some ways, Bryce's autobiography in one sense, although he always said to his mother and sister, who didn't like it that much, it is a work of fiction.
Yeah.
Then there's Tommy Fitzsaxby from Whitethorn, which Bryce always said was his most autobiographical work. And I think that had the strongest impression on me when I reread the works. But when you read so many of his books, reread them, Jack of Diamonds, Whitethorn, Tandia, Power of One, there are so many references to Africa, to working down the mines, to the advertising industry, to being in London. There's so many threads there that keep coming up over and over. Even the PTSD, which is always written about by the veterans, he features in his books, such as Four Fires. You think, is this your own PTSD from your own childhood with those cobwebs still clinging to your soul? And yet he wasn't a bitter person. He wasn't a depressive. He wasn't someone that said, poor me. In fact, he said, my dramatic childhood gave me great material for my books.
Yeah, well, look, in your opinion, it sounds a little bit like he didn't bury the sort of difficulty that he'd had. It sounds like he relayed some of that to the characters, for which he obviously has become world renowned for. Why do you reckon he kept the box of letters? What's your personal opinion on that?
I don't even know how he got them. He used to go to South Africa quite often to promote books. It could have been that his mother, Patty, gave them to him. It could be that she bought them out when she came only once to visit the family in Australia. It could be that Rosemary, his sister, sent them to them. He never mentioned them. I don't know if he just forgot them. And even in his old contact books that I've found, there were some people in his early life, and there were even their phone numbers. And he'd never mentioned those people, like Jean Minard, whom he worked with at the citrus farms after leaving school. Sadly, I tried to reach that number and it no longer worked. He may have passed away as well. But, Bryce used to put lids on things. He used to compartmentalize things. I think that's how he coped. And I think that's how he freed up his mind to write.
Yeah.
And I think it was a way, writing in novels is a great way of hiding from reality, of confronting a lot of things that are very difficult. And I really feel great compassion for him for doing that. But so many readers of Bryce Courtenay Storyteller are now going back and reading the books and saying they really see more into them now, which is really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. This might be a bit of a question that can be sort of associated with partnerships and long-standing partnerships. Were there any characters that you look back on and thought, oh, I can see a lot of similarities between myself and that character?
Do you mean myself and characters in his books?
Yeah.
Well, yes, a lot, because like Tommy in Four Fires, my father had very bad PTSD from being a prisoner of war. So on the Second World War, but, so yes, all of those characters I really relate to. And I mean, I worked on Four Fires with Bryce doing a lot of the research. So I think I really did relate to that a lot and understood it very, very well. In fact, I encouraged Bryce to focus on that subject a lot more in the book than he had originally thought of doing. So in that way I did. And I also liked the way he always celebrated strong women, resilient women who often carried the burden, if you like, through their love of looking after very damaged people. And my mother did that. My father was wonderful. We had an amazing, happy childhood. But it was tough on my mother at times dealing with Dad's PTSD. And so, it's really interesting that Bryce generally went out with strong women. He married me. He married Benita, also a very strong and remarkable woman, whom I was very fortunate to know well. And, women like Jessica, they were strong, resilient, brave women who kept their heads held high, even in the most daunting of circumstances.
So we've reached the halfway point of our webinar here. So I'm just going to quickly, once again, remind people that we're definitely welcoming your questions and happy to direct them towards Christine. If you do have any questions and you are using a screen reader, you have the keystroke Alt-H is what you're looking for to type your question in. You have just over half an hour to send those through. So definitely send them through. Would love to relay them through to Christine for you. Moving on from the webinar, or moving on from that, let's talk a little bit about your writing process. Now, I sort of touched on it a little bit, but you did speak a little bit about reaching these sort of writer's blocks, which is very challenging, especially as your first book. Can you describe some of these sort of moments where you feel like you hit like a brick wall and thought, how am I going to move around this?
Mostly it was to do with the lack of research that really bugged me, particularly in his early childhood. His sister, Rosemary, had also written an unpublished memoir. That was helpful, but there were errors in that at times, I think, and she had a very different perspective on their childhood. So again, I had to work out, well, what was it really like? Fortunately, again, she'd stayed with us in 2006, so I'd heard a lot from her point of view. As we all know, siblings' perceptions vary a lot. But that was difficult. And also the acrimony at times, now that's too strong a word, the different perspective that she and Bryce had about their mother. You sort of, I wanted to be kind to them and kind to Bryce's memory. So you had to sort of decide what level to write that about.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other things that were kind of hard to work out that tripped me up, like how was The Power of One published? How did that get to be published? There are many different people who claimed a role in that. And Bryce's perception of it, fortunately, was very helpful in the long interviews he did at the National Library, but that was quite difficult. And also even how, like Louis the Fly was created. Many people had a part to play in that, and many people claim it was theirs. And Bryce, of course, got most of the credit for that. But I wanted to be careful to acknowledge people for what they had done So that was, those sorts of things were difficult. And even the medical information, when I was writing about Bryce's later illnesses, I'm not a doctor, and I thought, oh God, this isn't right. This can't be right. So I had to ring up the doctors, and they'd look up their emails and say, no, he didn't, that's not what it was called. And no, it didn't happen then. I wanted to really make sure I got all that right.
Did you find that they were quite accommodating?
They were fantastic. I was very lucky. I mean, many of them loved Bryce and respect him. They were so amazed the book was being done. They jumped in, particularly people like Alex Hamill, because he had been his best mate and a colleague in the roller coaster of the advertising years Bryce was involved with. So his anecdotes, and he really made an enormous contribution. So I always regard this book, as a team effort. But, Jordan, one of the biggest problems for writing this book was just brain tiredness and fatigue and exhaustion and pressure, stress and anxiety. I mean, I'd always have a notepad by the bed, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night and say, oh, you didn't check that, or you didn't, that's wrong, or something. By the end of it, honestly, I was just like, you could have knocked me over with a feather, as they say. But I was also very dogged. I remember you've got to be like a dog with a bone, like Bryce was. You don't half do a book. You either do it and get it right, so you can walk away saying, I gave it my all. I did my best. I couldn't have done any better in the time. I didn't want to walk away and think I was lazy. I should have checked that out.
Yeah.
And I'm happy with the book. I mean, I could have done with more time. I'm happy with the book. I think there's 4 or 5 typos. There are also typos from the letters that are published, but we deliberately left those mistakes in because Bryce wrote those, and he was a bit dyslexic. So
yeah,
readers, please be understanding. That's why we left all those mistakes in.
So as you said, a sort of harrowing sort of experience for you for your first book. Obviously very, very fulfilling as well. There's a lot of resources out there around assisting new authors, but did you find yourself writing daily word counts, or were you a little bit more flexible with this sort of thing?
First, I didn't really care about word counts, but I had to care when I got a contract. Penguin Random House wanted 100,000 words. I wrote 122,000.
Yeah.
And they did cut down on some of my quotes, some of my letters, which I found a bit annoying, but they had to do it, I understand.
Yeah.
So, we kind of got there in the end. But I also produced a video called The Last Class about Bryce's final writing workshop. And I did remember a lot of those techniques that he always said, include a lot of dialogue, and used to say character is plot. And he used to say words are essentially emotional creatures, and they jump up and down with excitement when you use them properly. I also wanted to include quite a bit of humour to change the tone and the texture of the book. I wanted to make it entertaining as well. I was really determined to make the opening of each chapter and the end of each chapter really jump out, because that makes people want to keep reading, doesn't it?
Of course, yeah. And look, quoting Bryce for a minute here regarding the reader is always right. Coming away from this book, start to finish, should I say, what was your hope regarding what the reader will say on this book when you started and when you finished?
I think I agree with Bryce. You just want to feel that they think it's a wonderful book, that they enjoyed reading enormously, and they'll perhaps pass on to other people and say, you should read this. He said the best way of getting people to read a book is having 2 people telling each other over the back fence, hey, you should read this book. That's what I wanted, and I wanted people to feel that it was accurate, and that it was a genuine attempt to pay tribute to his life. Remember, it is a memoir. It's not an academic work. Someone will do that one day, perhaps. Someone will probably do a better one. Someone's probably writing one now. I don't know. But I hope that my book as well will be a very helpful resource for anyone that follows me.
definitely. And look, as I said, I'm biased, but I think it was a great literary work, and I think it will continue to be used. Talking on that, obviously you've lived an incredible life as well as an adventurer and entrepreneur. Is your own memoir still being written?
I haven't written a word since I finally handed in the book at 10:29 p.m. on August 22nd last year, feeling almost dead. I haven't written a word. I think about it though, and I will finish it. I don't think it will be published, to be honest, but I'd like to write it to give to my son Nima and just get it off my chest, I suppose, of my little life. And I like writing, but I'm going traveling later this year, Jordan. I'm going to write some stories about the places I'm going to, which I always have done. And I actually find writing a sanctuary from everyday life. I find it a real way to leave the world behind. And I love the creative and intellectual process. And I'm addicted to it. So the words will keep coming.
That was once again preempting my next question, which is very much around obviously taking stock during the pandemic with yourself being such a traveler, whether you'd found your calling as a writer. It sounds like you're going to be out traveling again once more if you haven't already. Yeah, so it sounds like your writing may be influenced by that when you return, I'm guessing, or you're trying to manage all of it at the same time.
I'll probably do a bit at the same time. I mean, I'm a bit of an incurable nomad, and I love walking in mountains. So I'm going to go to the Alps in France and Switzerland, and I'm trying to get to the Dolomites. So I'm now trying to recover from my tiredness, actually, and also just improve my fitness. But I think hopefully I'm a better writer now, and I'm looking forward to seeing what I'm like now, having done a book. But I wouldn't do another memoir like I've just done. Like, I've got friends who've said to me, oh, like Robert Swan, the polar explorer that is in the book, whom I've worked with for a long, long time. He's just, by the way, arrived at the South Pole with his team. And I think he'd like me to help work on a memoir of his life, say. But honestly, I'm not sure I would do another one. It's really got another layer of difficulty. And I think Bryce, in some ways, is very smart not to write a biography, because I think he well knew what it entails. I mean, obviously, April Fool's Day being the most terribly poignant and challenging and sad book that he ever wrote. He said if he had to write another book like that, he'd never write another word. He said, I would just have become a gardener.
Yeah, right. So we've got a couple of questions here from Namoy. Did fame change Mr. Courtenay much?
I think he liked being famous. I think it gave him an opportunity to meet a lot of other extraordinary people. I think he had quite, in some ways, believe it or not, perhaps like we all do, some low self-esteem. And I think that acknowledgement, that adulation, he liked it a lot. In other ways, he was a very private person and lived a very quiet life. He wasn't a celebrity that was out every night looking for a photographer to have himself in the paper. So there were times when being noticed, he found a little bit unsettling, although he'd never say no to a fan who wanted a photograph or an autograph.
Yeah, very well documented that. So the other question that Moy had, you might have touched on as well in regards to planning to write other books. It sounds a little bit like you might be looking at perhaps a fictional work as your next book or something along those lines.
Incredible to write a novel. I mean, that would be just so extraordinary and a great challenge. And I have thought about that. Haven't really come up with a storyline yet, but I think about it. I mean, I'm a great reader myself. I'm always reading all sorts of books. And I like reading biographies and autobiographies as well, but I love like spy thrillers, I love them. And I'm starting to think about something like that even. But I'm not sure yet. Ask me in about 6 months and I might have worked that out, but my family, of course, is saying, oh, don't write another book for a while, have a rest. But, you don't want to leave it too long. I think that's why Bryce kept writing. He never waited very long to start another book.
Yeah, definitely had a large sort of list of books that he was usually working on. Can I ask the question just in regards to some of the books that you have in your list of things to read? What are you reading and enjoying at the moment?
Well, as I said, I've just enjoyed really reading Le Carré's letters that his sons published after John Le Carré. Of course, David Cornwell was his name. After he passed away, my brother gave me an autobiography of Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister. I'm reading that at the moment. I've also finished a book by Charles Cumming. He's a Scottish spy thriller writer. That was very good. And I read the latest Daniel De Silva book, but I didn't think it was as good as his previous works. And I love going back to the classics. One of my two favourite books are probably The Great Gatsby, Moby Dick, and I agreed with Bryce. His favourite book was probably Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I also love poetry. I love the works of Emily Dickinson. And so I like reading poetry.
So Penguin's going to love me mentioning this, but we actually had on our last series Fiona McIntosh, who has written a many number of spy thrillers, and they are fantastic. So worth definitely having a look into those, especially if you're planning to travel to some of the places that are mentioned in those books. So we're getting to obviously 15 minutes before the end of the webinar. So once again, a reminder to people to get your questions in, because we are quickly running out of time, and I'm sure there will be a multitude of questions that you direct to me after the fact, and I'll be happy to pass them on to our guest today, Christine. So what I want to ask is, obviously we do have a many number of readers on the call. We also have some people that may be interested in writing as well. Do you have any advice that from your own experience, that you can give to any sort of aspiring authors looking to write something like a memoir for themselves or others?
Well, Roger Maynard, who is a British-based journalist who lives in Sydney, fortunately did a series of great interviews with Bryce, and you'll recall I included a lot of that material in the book. And those interviews, if you just look up Roger Maynard interviews Bryce Courtenay, there's 5 of them. And there's one in particular where he talks about how to write, tips about writing. They are really fantastic. If you listen to all of them, a lot comes through anyway about how to write. The other thing is just keep writing, and start by just writing some simple things. Like a great exercise Bryce used to give people in his writing course was he'd say, what did you do this morning? How did you spend yesterday? And then read it out loud. I found reading out loud what I wrote. I'm quite a sort of oral person, visual person. Bryce's work were very cinematic. I think that helps, but remember to include dialogue. I think dialogue gives an immediacy to a manuscript and makes it come alive, and it makes it real to people. And humour. Don't be too serious, and be prepared to be a bit vulnerable. Sometimes go out of your comfort zone, and that'll often be when you'll do your best writing. Don't be a fearless writer.
Yeah, look, and a lot of the other authors that we've spoken to have often spoken about dialogue being one of the more challenging things to write. So that's a great bit of advice that what you were talking about in regards to plot is dialogue as well. So it can often be the main reason why people do listen to books and read books. Can I ask a question? So you're obviously proud of the fact that Storyteller has become an audiobook as well. Did you were you involved at all with choosing the narrator, or did you sort of comb over countless hours of different narrators going, yep, this is the one, or did you kind of leave that to the powers that be on that one?
Well, Penguin Random House sent me some auditions of 2 or 3 readers that they regularly use. And I listened to them. And to be honest, I would have loved Humphrey Bower to have read it. He read nearly all of Bryce's books for the audio versions of his novels. But then Penguin Random House asked me to read the book. And I said, oh, I've got quite a husky, high-pitched voice. I don't think I'm right. But they said with autobiographies, biographies, they really like the writer to read it. Give it a go. So I went into the studio, and 53 hours later, I had read the book. They did it in sort of 3-hour blocks. And then I think the actual audio version that people can purchase online is about 18 hours. And, I really enjoyed doing it in a way because I was able to read through my book from start to finish. I knew it very well. That helps. I think it'd be harder to read a book you didn't know your way around. I always knew what was coming, but it was tiring. It was very intense,
Yeah, well, as I said, it can often make or break whether you have our community really enjoying the book, and they've definitely enjoyed the book. So I would say that the time spent was worth it for our audience. What can we expect from yourself in 2023?
I'm going to continue to work with the Australian Himalayan Foundation. I have always followed my father and mother's example, and Bryce's example, of course, of giving back and doing things to help more vulnerable people. I think that is the gift of giving. I enjoy it. So I'll continue in that role, doing some traveling and really catching up with many dear friends I haven't seen for a long time in France and in England. And I think just trying to keep my aging body together. You do notice need to a bit more, keep up the fitness, careful with the diet. I hope my little cat Ophelia survives. She's had a bit of a rough time in the last year with her health. She's in the book, of course. She wanted to be on the front cover. I think just and continuing to support Bryce's legacy, and to support his wonderful readers who've been so kind and loving and have been a great source of strength to me. And I really do salute them for all that they've done in the last decade since Bryce passed away.
And look, it must have been somewhat telling for yourself as well. Christine Courtenay's first novel released just before Christmas time, with all of Bryce's comments about him belonging under the Christmas tree with the chocolate and the socks. That must have been something that kind of you must have got some kind of satisfaction from, I imagine.
It really did feel quite strange that I was having a book under the Christmas tree, little old me. But of course, it had to come out then. That's when publishers sell most books. But also, it was in Bryce's tradition. But it was also quite emotional, to think that there was this silence of where was Bryce's book. I feel that every Christmas. But he wrote 21 books in 23 years, having not sat down to write fully till 52. So we can just now celebrate his legacy. And I try to do what he said to me just before he passed away. He said, darling, no tears. I want you to embrace the gift of life.
Very, very telling, especially the last 2 years that we've all experienced.
Indeed.
Can I also just ask another question? Obviously, you mentioned in the book that this book was written for Bryce's children. How many books did Bryce read to the children during his lifetime? Was it something that he was considered a tradition, or was it something that he kept?
You mean reading his own book to them?
Yeah.
Well, they were adults when he wrote The Power of One. So he never read them his books, but of course they read them.
Yeah.
And now it's incredible that Bryce's grandchildren are reading Bryce Courtenay Storyteller. That really meant the world to me. I had a little private sort of launch event for the book in October, and to present the book to Jake and Ben Courtenay. Marcus unfortunately wasn't well that day, was the most emotional experience, and so wonderful to see the joy in their hearts about the book having been written, because as they said, we were quite young when Pa died, and we really didn't have a chance as adults to sort of talk to him about his life. And I think that has really meant more to me than anything, to know that they do know more about their grandfather who loved them so much.
And from somebody who's done a hell of a lot of research to put it all together as well, imagine there must be some form of great satisfaction that comes with that. So look, you've been very kind with your time. Thank you so much, Christine. I'm going to start wrapping up there. Once again, thank you for your time and telling us a bit about the book. As I said, I'm biased. It's a fantastic book, and I have a feeling we're going to see some more books from you in the near future, and I'm looking forward to that as well.
Thank you, Jordan. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've learned a lot myself by talking to you today. You're a great interviewer, truly.
Far too kind as always. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
All the best.
Bye for now.
Vision Australia.
Blindness,
Low vision.
Opportunity.
Vision Australia logo. 3 navy blue ovals linked together diagonally within a bright yellow rectangle.